Welcome to the Parenting with Impact podcast with your hosts Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster, co-creators of ImpactParents.com, an online community, award-winning blog, and service organization helping parents all over the world to raise complex kids become capable, independent adults.
Hi everyone, Elaine and Diane here, and we know that you want your complex kids to grow up to be happy and independent, and yet you're not always sure how or when to help with that.
In this podcast, we'll encourage you to collaborate with all kinds of complex kids and support them in navigating life and learning.
And we'll interview leading experts from around the world, as well as parents in our own community, talking about how training for parents actually helps these complex kids.
We'll talk about the issues we hear parents struggling with all the time and how a coach approach can support and empower your amazing young people.
We won't tell you what to do. We're going to help you figure out how. So let's move on to the next conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. We want to talk about a really present, important, current event issue today. As most of you probably know by now, in June of this year, the Surgeon General came
2024.
2024, thank you. The Surgeon General came out with not only a warning calling for labels on social media platforms, but also a big op-ed in the New York Times talking about the impact of social media on our youth and on the youth mental health challenges that are being faced right now. This comes on the heel of an advisory that was put out in 2023, a social media and youth mental health advisory that the Surgeon General put out. So there's a real effort in the last couple of years to raise awareness and attention in the public arena to not just the benefits, but the threats that are posed on young people in the wake of this kind of a new media, a new way of being in the world that was released before there was an opportunity to explore it. Right? Is that a fair way to put it, Diane?
Yeah, it is. Well, and I think those of you who are listening, this is the Surgeon General's article, and desire to put a warning label on some of the social media platforms doesn't come as a surprise, because we know that this is shut like this sort of, we were pulling up the data, and there was a study back in 2019 that was talking about social media and mental health in adolescents, and teens in that age group are two times more likely to have mental anxiety and depression when they are they linked the amount of time they spend on social media with the rates of anxiety and depression, is the way I'll simplify it.
So specifically, the quote is that adolescents who spend 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. And the average daily use in this age group in the summer of 2023 was 4.8 hours. And
I know a lot of you are like thinking about more than 4.8 hours. We're recording this and it's summertime in the US. And I think schools are almost out in Europe. And a lot of you are really worried about the amount of time your kids are spending, not just on social media, but tech generally. There's all kinds of battles and challenges and things like that are related to your kids' executive function challenges, related to your kids' hyper focus, related to the family battles that you're having. And so this is a really hot topic generally in our community that comes up all the time, I think, in our groups.
Yeah. I want to set the stage with a couple more pieces of data before we move into the impact for us as parents, right? So one of the other things he spoke to specifically was the way that social media makes young people feel about their bodies. And so whether it's in the gender arena in terms of body dysmorphia or anorexia, bulimia, eating disorders, there's a whole impact on body awareness and acceptance that's happening as a result of social media. The other thing that he said in his article was that a year ago, he came out with this advisory, and that a lot of the changes that need to happen on a more macro level. So he talked about recommendations for policymakers, for the platforms themselves, as well as for the public. So he's calling for legislation from Congress to shield young people from online harassment and abuse and exploitation. He's calling upon the platforms themselves to protect sensitive data, to restrict the use of features like push notifications, scrolling to protect kids from some of the features that happen from excessive use and the attraction to it. And he's also talking about protecting kids from exposure to inappropriate materials, which we're going to be talking about on a number of podcast episodes because this is becoming such a hotbed issue in our community.
Yeah.
Looks like you were ready to jump in with something.
No, I want to wait for you to be done with the backdrop here.
We're just like, there's a lot going on. And so he's calling on society to do something different. And so he's calling on parents to talk to each other and to collaborate with each other and to set agreements with each other in friend groups, and for Congress to take action and for the platforms themselves to begin to self-regulate. It's a big ask in a world where we've been dominated by technology and social media so quickly that we didn't slow down and step into it intentionally. We are in this constantly reactive phase around technology.
And even well-meaning, if you think about the regulations, I remember when my kids were little, it's like you have to be 13 before you were on this platform, and they had all the rules and the agreements and things like that. And so it was as good as it could get at the time. And it goes so fast that it's hard to keep up with it generally. So I love.
Wait. Let me just throw one more thing, because the irony is not lost on me that I saw this on social media.
Yeah.
But it's a really incredible piece that I'll put a link to by the man who wrote the book Sapiens, who is saying that we are in a very different time than we've ever been in before, because for the first time in the history of the world, we don't know what to expect 20 years from now, and our kids don't know what to expect. We don't know what to teach our kids in school because we don't know what they're going to need to learn, because we're so uncertain of what the world is going to be like in 20 years. And it is the first time in history that's ever been the case.
We could have a whole philosophical,
right?
We need a glass of wine instead of a cup of coffee this morning. So I love the macro level. We could have conversations about what will happen with this, what will not happen with this. And ultimately, even the Surgeon General was saying part of this starts at the local level. Part of this starts at the school level or the community level or the family groups level, that sort of thing. And I think that's really where we want to jump in, is the sort of, what is it that you could be doing with this?
Our role.
What's our role in this process? Because it is hard. And I know that those of you who are listening are struggling mightily with 20-year-olds who are on the internet 12, 14,
4 in the morning.
4 in the morning, 24 hours a day. When they're not at work, they're online. Or you've got a kid who wants to be online and you're afraid to let them online. Or it's just sort of, there's all of this stuff going on. And so where do we jump in? Because a lot of this is about figuring out what you want as a parent, figuring out how to engage your child collaboratively, and then figuring out what the conversations are. My brain just went linear on this, Elaine, but it's like this sort of, what do I want, me and whoever I'm co-parenting with? What's my intention? What would I love to have happen? How do I involve my child collaboratively in figuring that out? And then how do I communicate about that with my kid?
And so I love it because you're linear and you go what about me? And I'm circular and I go, what about the world? And yes to those kind of 3 steps. And then what does it mean to be the parent who is going into the school and saying, what are we going to do about this, and agitating for change? And for some of us, the role is, how do I be in relationship with my kid around this? And for some of us, the role is, in order to be in my relationship with my kid, I need to be doing something in my community. Right. So let's start with us and our kid. How about that?
Yeah. No, and I love the public service announcement about be out there, be in the grassroots, connect in. If we've got some links on that, I don't know if we do or not, but we can close on that piece of it. So us and our kids, I think for many of us, like, we know what we don't want. Like, we can see our kids' behavior. We can see our spouse's behavior. Quite frankly, it may be our spouse, it may be us. We can see the behaviors that we don't want and push against them, but it's hard for us to go through, okay, so what, we need the internet. We're on the computer right now recording this lovely podcast episode, right?
And I'm on to via the technology.
Right? It's just sort of, I'm on tech all the time. I'm paying attention, and I would honestly, post-pandemic, I spent some time really looking at what am I spending my time on? Where do I want to be spending my time on? Am I spending my time in a healthy way or a not healthy way? It's this sort of, there's this first question, which is like, what do you want your relationship to be with technology, knowing how vast and fabulous and pervasive technology is, where my brain starts.
Right. Well, here's what I hear you saying, and I really appreciate this, is, as we always say with everything, starting with ourselves.
Right.
So what you're saying is the first place to start in this is to pay attention to my use of technology, what I think about it before we start trying to change our kids' behavior or even deciding what we want for them, focusing on ourselves. And I'll tell a story on myself. A couple of weeks ago, actually, I had a weird, I don't know, my kids were in town and we were watching a movie in the back of the house, and I left my phone in the front of the house. And I noticed how often during that movie I went to reach for my phone and it wasn't there. Sometimes I'm looking up trivia. Sometimes, that made me think of something. I want to send a text to someone, or it wasn't like I wanted to be on scrolling on a social media platform, but I became very aware of how many times in that 2-hour framework that I reached for my phone and felt uncomfortable that it wasn't there.
Oh, totally. I relate to that because I'm like, people in my circle call me Googleicious because like I'm constantly searching for something, right? And so I did the same thing at dinner recently. We had the whole family over, and I would have normally been the one that's, oh, let's look that up. And, oh, wait, what about this? And because this hunger for learning and what is the detail instead of speculation, particularly when you're with family members with different opinions, it's like, well, what are the actual facts here, right? And it was funny. True story, we ended up switching to Alexa. And so I started asking Alexa to Google for me since I couldn't do it myself with my phone. But again, it's a healthy way to engage with technology, but it's still like this sort of hungry to like, oh, wait, it's become a habit.
And it's funny because I remember when the internet first started, y'all. But
Me too.
seriously, I remember a friend of mine saying when we could first start, we were watching some movie, and when he was saying, remember when we used to be able to have a conversation and we would all get curious, but we would have to think about it. We would have to remember, and we would have to make connections. We couldn't just look it up and answer the question. We actually had to process through. And in some ways, we've lost that activity of engagement because it's all right at our fingertips. So we're not slowing down and thinking about who was that person in that movie and what else were they in, or whatever the
and here's what I want to add to that, because you and I are both in the generation of people that remember the world before the internet.
Right.
And there are a lot of people even listening that don't remember the world before the internet. And so there's this tendency we have as humans to reminisce as if the good old days were better, as opposed to the good old days being different, right? And I think that's the piece that I want to speak to just for a second, is doing it that way was great at the time. Let's not make the way we do it today wrong. It's just different, right?
I don't mean to make it wrong. What I'm saying is that there's a whole way of engaging with thought and information and connections that's different, that we no longer lean into. Yeah. It's a whole way of thinking and communicating that is a lost art.
And I think that's part of what we as parents struggle with, right? Because we want our kids to be doing, parents all the time, I was out playing, I was out doing this. It's like this sort of,
I had conversations with,
right. And the world is different now. And so the second step, what do you want for yourself? And the second one, honestly, I'd like to invite us to a reality check, because yes, we want our kids to be physically active. Yes, we want our kids to be focused on learning. I remember when my kids were younger, we had this thing where you needed to be physical at least once a day, but you could use the internet to do it. So you could do an online yoga class, or you could do a Wii or whatever it was. It's just, so instead of saying, I want you to have time off technology, it was this sort of, how do you help your kids how do you acknowledge the fact that we're attached to our technology, and probably will be more so, honestly, in the next 10 to 15 years, and have them have, what is it, Randy Coleman says, a healthy diet of tech diet, right?
Yeah. Okay. Let's pause there, take a break, and come back. So, right now, we've set the stage and we've talked about calling upon all of us as adults to examine our own usage and our own relationship with technology and be thoughtful and mindful about that before we move into how do we want to be with our kids. You want to take a break here and come back and talk about how we want to be with our kids.
Yes.
Hi, it's Elaine. And if you like this podcast, you'll love our coach approach. Whether you're a parent looking for support or a professional supporting families, we invite you to download a free guide with 12 key coaching tools at impactparents.com/gift. You can begin using a coach approach to help kids become more independent or improve all of your conversations at work and at home. That's impactparents.com/gift.
Welcome back, everybody. Diane and I are in a philosophical slash, I don't know what to call it, conversation about technology and the Surgeon General's warning about social media platforms and mental health of our kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about our kids.
And I love that we're starting with our own relationship. And I think some of you'll be going, yeah, but I'm a grown up. Yeah, but it's just, what is our role with regard to our kids? And I think that the Surgeon General's warning, right? It's a warning, right? It's the same sort of thing. It's this sort of kids who spend more than a certain amount of time are more likely to struggle with anxiety and depression, right? That's the bottom line for me out of that. And so as parents, we have to step closer, is the language I would use, to our kids' technology use, not necessarily to just to limit, and this is what I would advocate for. It may not just be about the number of hours, but it's about how are they using it and what are they getting from it. And part of it is having conversations with our kids about what they are observing on social media, right? It's this sort of, if they're seeing stuff, and I don't know whether this is, I know we're doing the whole series on internet porn, but I remember really distinctly the first time my kid came across something that I really would rather them not have come across on the internet. It was, okay, we got to talk about it. Tell me what you saw. What was it like for you? How did it feel? What do you think that was like for that female whose picture it was like? That sort of, we talked about it. And so the first step is like, how do we step closer as parents? And for most of us, closer is not let's put the foot down, although that's the part that we're going to be interested in doing because it's, oh my gosh, I got to put the foot down. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to have our kids develop healthy relationships with the internet, with social media over their lifetime, because they're going to be with social media much longer than we ever were. And so it's not about restriction as much as it is about understanding and engaging and making healthier choices. Now, I don't know where you would go with that, but that's
well. So here's what's coming up. Okay, is in March of 2020. You guys might remember that month. Diane and I were doing a digital sanity summit. We did a really cool summit, interviewing some of the leading experts in the world on technology and kids. Right, and that summit is still available, and it's fascinating to me how relevant it still is.
Yeah.
And one of the themes that came up again and again and again in all of those conversations was exactly what you just pointed to. The goal is not to eliminate technology, to get them off technology. The goal is to help them see that they are in relationship with technology and to help them become conscious of how they want to be in relationship and to be able to use it as a tool to support them in their lives instead of something that is controlling or dominating their lives or that they're using to avoid their lives, which is what very often happens in our community. And so what you're speaking to, I think that's so important is if we talk about how do we step closer, it goes back to the same thing we always come back to, which is we step into relationship. We get curious, right?
Well, and I just had this visual of a kid going down the slide at the playground. So this is going to be different depending on the age of your child. So let's start with that premise, because those of you who have younger kids are in a situation where, you might say, we need to shut some of this down, or we need to have some more controls and agreements and rules and things like that. And as your kids get older, it's harder to do that. So I had this visual of a kid going down the slide about, we don't just go to the park with the big giant slide and let our kids go down the slide for themselves for the first time. It's this sort of, we're going to help them down. We're going to engage with them. We're going to make sure they feel safe and confident and are not doing something stupid like hanging over the edge of the slide or whatever it is, right? It's this sort of, again, it's that stepping closer rather than, okay, no slides for you. We can help our kid to figure out how to use the slide in a healthy manner. So hopefully that analogy is helpful for you.
It's great. So one of the podcast episodes with John Paul Simon, which we'll link to, talks about that issue, the prevention piece of how do we put rules and parameters and expectations in place. And it's akin to teaching a kid to cross the street. You want to teach your kid about technology. So for those of you with younger kids, the Surgeon General's warning is really a call for prevention and for a more conscious way to bring your kids into relationship, to start that relationship consciously from a very, very early age. Yeah. Whatever that age is, to not just hand them the phone, but to make sure that when you're engaging with them, you're helping them understand the rules of engagement and how to use it. Right.
Yeah. Well, the other podcast that just popped in that we probably should connect to is effective agreements. And so that's the next kind of phase is, yes, for rules when our kids are younger, more for agreements when our kids are, preteens, teens, young adults, even this sort of what I remember distinctly. I always tell stories on myself, but having a conversation with my kid who's everybody's always using their phones and they don't have any restrictions at all. And it was like, the rule can't be unlimited technology, right? So what should the agreement be? What feels healthy? What feels safe? And to really just have that dialogue about if they're held to, how do I make this safe? Because I know there's scary stuff out there or stuff that's not appropriate or stuff that's whatever for me as a young teen. How do I even think about the fact that it shouldn't just be wide open?
Right. Well, and you're telling tales on yourself. I'll tell the tale on myself, which is I think that because my husband came out of the tech world, I think we were way too permissive early on and that we weren't putting enough parameters in place because I thought because my kids are smart kids that they would know better or that I don't know what assumptions I was making. I don't think they were good ones. And I don't think I handled it as consciously and as well as I hope I would today. And it's interesting because my kids are young adults and I am in much better conversations with them about technology now than I was even when they were teenagers, because they are old enough now to see the challenges and the limitations of it. And all of them are consciously saying, I'm going to put my phone down. I'm going to be off the grid for a while because they're choosing it now.
And I think that's an important piece to plug in for folks, because I know a lot of parents, particularly with gaming and tech use, it's like, they're like, my kid would game 24 hours a day. And it wasn't until my gamer started feeling the effect of gaming more than they wanted to, that they were able to go, okay, wait a second, maybe I do need to do something different about my relationship with my computer. Right. It takes them, we always say this in Sanity School, it says it has to be their agenda on some level in order to really get their buy in the same way. And
yes, and just because it has to be their agenda doesn't mean, and we talked about this in a group coaching call this week, it was really powerful. Just because we want them to be leading life on their agenda doesn't mean we're not allowed to have an agenda or have expectations.
Right.
It's about how we enroll them in it and bring them to those conversations. It's about building enough trust to be able to have those conversations with them. Because I was talking to a group of parents of young adults. It's not that you can't expect your kid to eventually get a job and move out.
Right.
But you have to work with them on their agenda to do that. But it's still okay to say, my expectation is that you're not going to be living here for the next 20 years. That's a fair and reasonable expectation. And so the same thing around technology is, I'm not saying how you should do this, but I do think it's fair and reasonable, 15-year-old, 12-year-old, 17-year-old, to have some engagement agreements about how you're going to engage with technology and what is and is not a good choice for you. And I want you to be part of creating that, right? And it's not about imposing it, but it is about enrolling them in that conscious, thoughtful decision making.
And I'm laughing because so many of our parents say, my kid won't even talk to me. How could I get my kid in a conversation like that? And I can imagine myself, like, so this is me back 10 years ago when my kids were younger going, we can either talk about it and I can get your opinion about it, or I can just set the rule. Which would you rather have happen?
Or if you want to have a smartphone, that's great. If you don't want to have this conversation, then you could just have a good old fashioned
flip phone.
That's fine. I'm fine with
They
that.
still have those, don't they?
They do. They're coming back, actually. People are choosing them again as a way to regulate their social media use. Right. But notice how both of us said that from a place of non-judgment. Matter of fact, either or, you could do this or this. It wasn't, well, you have to keep our snark out of it. And that can be hard for us to do.
Well, and I think that the other piece of it is honoring and hearing their perspective, right? It's just, and taking the time and not doing it from oh, you're wrong, right? It's just, but really go, okay, if that's what they believe is true for them, or if that's what they believe is true, because a lot of times they don't see what we see. And it's hard to collaborate with someone if they see it completely differently than we do. And there's a gift in really understanding how they see it. And I promise you that most of them are not going to say it's fine for me to be on whatever I want to be on for 24 hours a day. When it really comes down to it, if you're fighting with them, yeah, probably. But if you're trying to sit down and just have a creative conversation, yeah.
Avoid the word sit down, though. Never
sit
down. Do it standing at the kitchen counter or whatever.
Driving in the car.
Right. So here's what's coming up, because we need to start wrapping this conversation. And what I'm aware of as we're talking is, first of all, there's a lot of amazing resources in the show notes today. So really take the time, go to the show notes. I encourage you, if you haven't, to read the Surgeon General's, we'll have all the links in the show notes, the article, to read the advisory from 2023. It's not that long and it's fascinating. And to start the breadcrumb conversations with, if you've got older kids, but the younger kids, again, it's about thinking about how do we want to begin to teach them. And with the older kids, it's like, how do we start dropping some breadcrumbs? And you could talk about the Surgeon General's advisory and ask their opinion about it to begin to invite them to some constructive conversations around it. Again, not to tell them what to do, but to raise it. Like when I had that awareness about that movie night, I went to my family the next day and I said, guys, this is what I noticed happened last night.
Yeah. So third party conversations or second party conversations is what I would call it. It's like this sort of outing yourself and your own challenges and just being like, hey, this is what I'm noticing about myself. Or, hey, the article said something about anxiety and depression in adolescents that use a lot of technology. What do you know? What do you notice in your friends? Do you have any friends that are doing this? This sort of third-party conversations can be really very much more open and non-judgment, like the temperature stays lower, right?
Yeah. The other thing I want to reinforce something you alluded to earlier, which is our kids use social media in lots of ways, and how they use it is very important. Another link we'll put in the show notes is the conversation we did after the International Conference on ADHD about the technology presentations we went to and talking about, is it addiction or not? So there's a reference in here for that. Because some of our kids, a lot of their social world is online. And so this is not about shutting down their social connection. It's about finding a healthy balance of where and how they get social connection in their lives, and being thoughtful and intentional about it. Right?
So we could talk about this all day, but
oh my gosh, we could. Thank you for taking the space to do this with me, Diane, because I think this is such an important conversation. Yeah. And as Diane alluded to, we've got a lot of other conversations in the podcast about it. Again, I invite you to the show notes today. Take some time. For those of you for whom this episode is coming out in the summer, give yourself a little homework time on this to think about it during the downtime and give yourself some space to cue yourself up for the year that's coming as we go back to school in a couple of months, or in a month for some of us. Anything else, Di?
No, that's it.
Okay. I just want to say, as always, you guys, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening, because thank you for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. Your engagement, your thoughtfulness, your attention makes a difference. Take care, y'all.
See you soon.
Hi, y'all. It's Elaine here, and I've come back because as I've been writing up the show notes for the episode Diane and I did about the Surgeon General warning, I realized that we didn't go back to what we said at the beginning and to talk about there's the role for us, there's the role for us with our families, and then there's the role for us in our communities. And I want to make sure to come back to some of us figure out how to support our families best by engaging in our communities, by doing things in our schools, by creating organizations such as Impact, by starting nonprofits. And so if you're sort of a socially minded community organizing kind of a person, I want to say that there's one more thing that we can do as parents in terms of responding to the Surgeon General warning. And that's to remember that it is up to us to start the conversations in our schools and with our administrators and with other parents, and that we can convene a group of parents to talk about how do we want to handle it. You know, we worry about, I don't want to be that parent who, and yet it's those parents who make a difference. And so if that's your inclination, and I'm not trying to convince anybody to do that, but if you are so inclined and a community organizing kind of a person, think about what kinds of conversations you want to have in your school community, in your friend community, with administrators, with other parents of kids in your grades or in your kids' schools, and initiate a conversation to start thinking about how we as a community really want to begin to think consciously and respond to this really important warning from the Surgeon General. Thanks for that little extra moment. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For the essentials of Elaine and Diane's coach approach to parenting, download a free tip sheet at impactparents.com/podcast.
Behavior therapy training for parents is actually recommended as a first-line treatment for complex kids. For information about Sanity School, our training program for parents or teachers, which has helped thousands of families around the globe, visit impactparents.com/Sanity School.